Well, halfway through the holy month of Ramadan, and at a time when the Christian Easter dawned, we have confirmation that these cynical airdrops of minute amounts of aid, unplanned, improperly distributed, etc., is continuing. Only this time it appears that the United States has been joined by the other government so complicit in what has happened in Gaza, the British, have also been dropping aid. And some of it has dropped into the sea, where we now have confirmation, we don't know how many, but certainly people, desperate to get food for their families, have drowned trying to get their hands on aid that has blown into the sea. And at the same time, we still have this incredible situation of mile upon mile, kilometer on kilometer of trucks laden with food, with water, with medical aid, with all sorts of things to sustain people in Gaza, stuck at Rafah, held back by the Israelis. And this has created the terrible image of famine, of mass starvation. And for some reason, famine seems to be something which terrifies people much more than the horror of bombs dropping and blowing off limbs and killing people, which has been happening so often and by so many thousands in Gaza at the moment. Famine has prompted Ireland, for example, to become the first country to stand with South Africa in the International Court of Justice to condemn Israel for probable genocide. And that should not surprise anyone, because Ireland is a country where probably the deepest folk memory is of what is known in the Irish language as the Great Hunger, the famine of 1847 to about 1851, where a quarter, and this is generally agreed by most historians now, a full quarter of Ireland's population either died of starvation, malnutrition, and diseases brought about by that famine, or left the country. And many of them left and went across the ocean, the huddled masses, to Ellis Island, which was the entry to the New World, to New York. And there, the Irish became one of the largest voting blocs in the eastern United States, certainly Boston and New York. And at this very time of year, on the 17th of March, we have St. Patrick's Day, the Irish National Day. It seems almost grotesque to look at what was happening in New York on that day compared to what was happening in Gaza. But this shows the strength of the Irish feeling in New York. Of course, the same applies in other parts of the world as well. In Australia, where many Irish rebels, so-called terrorists of their day, who saw themselves as freedom fighters, just as happens today and is happening in Gaza, in fact, in terms of terminology, were shipped to penal colonies in Australia. And there too, on March the 17th, you had the celebrations. And at that very time, the Irish government, with famine looming in Gaza, declared their support on the genocide case against Israel. And as I said, it shouldn't be any surprise, because you see, what is often forgotten is that Ireland was the first colony of Britain. It suffered all the land seizures, all the brutality, all the settlements, all the ills of colonialism. And it went on for hundreds of years. There were many rebellions, going back to the time of, well, even before, but Wolfe Tone in 1798. The United Irishmen, they were called. He happened to be a Protestant in a largely Catholic country, but he led united Catholics and Protestants who saw themselves as Irish and wanted to be rid of the exploitation and the oppression of the British. He was sentenced to be hanged, and he would have been hanged publicly, as the Irish say, like a dog. He asked to be shot like a soldier. they refused. Somehow, we don't know whether he did it himself or someone assisted him. He died the night before he was due to be hanged in 1798, his throat cut. So there are plenty of these stories which are part of Irish folk memory. One of the reasons that Ireland became the first Western country to ban apartheid South African goods, late in the day, admittedly, in 1987, they have a history of that. And the main history goes back to the idea of the Great Hunger, of the famine, where there were mass graves. So many people died. But also those who could manage got aboard ships, crammed into the hell holes, and got to Ellis Island, got to New York, got to Boston. Since then, they have formed a large voting bloc. You have in the United States system a situation where those lobby groups that have a lot of money, such as the National Rifle Association and AIPAC, that supports Zionist Israel, have a lot of money and effectively buy congressmen, senators, perhaps even presidents, or at least influence them to take decisions and make policies that suit their particular agendas. But you also have, on the ground, a huge voting bloc of the Irish, and they are going to have, I think, a profound influence in this coming election in November, because this issue of famine and of Gaza has again raised the whole issue of Ireland and what actually happened. And the fact that it happened around about Easter is also vitally important, because on Easter of 1916, we had the Easter Uprising, which is something that everyone who has any knowledge of Ireland is aware of. It's something that changed history, where a group of people, of volunteers, again dubbed terrorists by the British, saw themselves as freedom fighters, rose up and in the city of Dublin decided to take on the British. The Irish were waiting for a shipment of arms to come in by sea with guns, ammunition. It never got there. The British managed to seize it at sea. They didn't know what it was for, presumably, but they knew it was coming to Ireland. And the Irish, therefore, cancelled the leadership, among the leadership of the Irish, cancelled part of this uprising, which was supposed to be national. So instead of about 14 or 15,000 different volunteers, heavily armed, rising up around the country, only about 2,000 did in Dublin. And that led to the Great Easter Uprising. Now, that was not, and I think most historians, most responsible historians will admit, the majority of people were probably opposed to this uprising because it dislocated their lives completely. And the British then proceeded to attack and to bring in, they brought in 14,000 more troops, they brought in artillery, and the fighting commenced. What the British then proceeded to do was to alienate the very people who perhaps didn't care one way or the other, but were certainly not in favour of the uprising, even if they weren't necessarily totally pro-British. They declared, for example, that any man caught within the circle of the centre of the city that was held by the rebels was to be regarded as a rebel. In other words, everyone was a member of the IRA, or the Irish Citizens' Army. They didn't actually distinguish, as is not distinguished in Gaza either. They're all in Hamas, whether it's Islamic Jihad or PLO or whatever. And even if they're completely non-aligned, and that's what actually happened. Once the British managed to crush the uprising and the leadership, Padraig Pearse, and the great revolutionary socialist Connolly surrendered. Connolly was himself so badly injured that he couldn't walk, but they were taken off to prison, and then the leadership were executed, they were shot. Connolly couldn't stand, so they strapped him to a chair and shot him, which of course created within Ireland yet another great story, a great tragedy. The British then set about rounding up and persecuting anyone they suspected of being sympathetic to the cause, which meant that I would imagine in a matter of weeks, let alone months, people who had not necessarily supported the uprising became totally supportive of that uprising. It has taken famine to raise, I think, the interest of the world, the focus of the world on what is happening in Gaza. And it has also brought the focus onto what has happened historically with colonies, with colonialism, with settlement. And it's going to have, I suspect, as I have said, a quite profound effect, perhaps, on the United States election in November. It's quite easy to realize how important that Irish voting bloc is when you realize that perhaps the most popular president of modern times in the United States was John F. Kennedy, who in 1963 made a huge wave of publicity throughout America and Europe, for that matter, when he visited Ireland and was referred to his home country, or where he came from. The Kennedys did indeed. But then, of course, so did Barack Obama.
Let me offer the hearty greetings of tens of millions of Irish Americans who proudly trace their heritage to this small island. Ours is a proud, enduring, centuries-old relationship that we are bound by history and friendship and shared values. After all, never has a nation so small inspired so much in another.
And of course, we now have the man generally and more widely known now as bumbling Joe Biden, who also has a family that traces back to County Mayo in the wild west of Ireland.
Everything between Ireland and America runs deep. Our history, our heritage, our sorrows, our future, our friendship, our joys.
I am proud to be a descendant of Irish immigrants hailing from County Mayo and County Louth. And being Irish, without fear of contradiction, has shaped my entire life.
And all of them made a big visit to the country, to Ireland. There's this constant reference back to Ireland. And now we have the remembrance, if you like, the bringing again to the forefront the very thing that triggered that mass migration to North America, the famine. And the fact that famine now has, one could argue, finally triggered the Irish government into supporting the South African claim of genocide at the International Court of Justice. And in the process of this, there will be closer looks at the history of Ireland, including that Easter Uprising of 1916, how it was conducted, who conducted it, and how the English, the British, responded to it in a way that one could see parallels with what has happened today in Gaza with the Israeli troops, the way that they have on a massive, much larger scale, of course. It's all a matter of scale, but it was the same basic principle of victimization leading to the majority of people ending up supporting the resistance, the people who saw themselves as freedom fighters and the opposition who saw them as terrorists.